Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today, in our 451st episode, we're going to be talking about Victorian-era dinosaurs with Will Tattersdill, who is an expert in that field.
Mm-hmm.
Well, really in the Victorian side of writing and how that applies to dinosaurs, which is really interesting. We also have a bunch of news, including a new ankylosaur. And thank you to everybody who sent this new ankylosaur to us in our Discord, because I always love a new ankylosaur.
There's also a new ornithopod.
Nice. Those are good too. And of course, we have a dinosaur of the day. And this week it's Ilokelesia, I think is how it's pronounced. That pronunciation guide is not what I would have guessed for how it's spelled. But it's also spelled in a way that no other word I've ever seen is quite spelled like.
Well, the genus name comes from the Mapuche language. Maybe you have seen it before, because we have talked about dinosaurs that have derived from the Mapuche language.
That's true, we have. And they're always a little bit challenging for me, but I am getting more used to them. And before we get into that and our news, we want to thank some of our patrons, and we have 4 new patrons to thank this week. And they are Katie, that's James Allwright, Thomasaurus, and G-Rex. And G-Rex has been a patron for a while and just bumped their pledge way up along with their dad. So we really appreciate that.
Yes, thank you.
And then rounding out our shout-outs, we've got Reed, Kentrosaurus, Keith, Lawrence, Ben at Jurassic Site B, and Polacanthus. And Polacanthus is very fitting because I was reading a bunch about Polacanthus for this, which was what the play on word of Polacanthus is. And every time I read Polacanthus, I was thinking, is it Polacanthus or Polacanthus? And then I realized my Wisconsin accent, I say Polacanthus with that sort of nasally O instead of Polacanthus a lot of the time anyway. But yeah, thank you all for supporting our show.
Yes, thank you. We really appreciate it. And I know we keep saying this. We're probably going to keep on saying this because it's true. We could not do this show without our supporters, our Dino-Know-It-Alls. So thank you for being part of our community.
So jumping into the news, I'm going to kick it off with the new ankylosaur because those need to go first.
Need.
I don't want to leave the ankylosaurs hanging. My little buddies.
They're not so little.
That's true. This new one is not very little either. So there's a new ankylosaur from Dinosaur Isle, and it's named Vectipelta barredi. I should mention that it was published by Stuart Pond and others in the Journal of Systematic Paleontology.
And Dinosaur Isle, that's the same of the Isle of Wight?
It is, yes. Vectipelta, the name is, quote, derived from the Roman name for the Isle of Wight, Vectis, and pelta, meaning shield in Latin, referring to the characteristic dermal armor, end quote. You get pelta at the end of a lot of ankylosaurs because of their big shield-like backs. And then barredi is, quote, in honor of Professor Paul M. Barrett in recognition of his major and ongoing contributions to dinosaurian vertebrate paleontology and his importance to a bunch of initials for the authors, as a mentor, supervisor, colleague, and friend, end quote.
That's very nice. I remember seeing in the headlines, a lot of it was like, "And dinosaur named in honor of Professor."
Yeah. And I'd like to, it ends with and friend, and the last of the initials is Susanna Maidment, and we always see them together. They seem like very good friends. It's very sweet. So Vectipelta, like Sabrina said, is from Isle of Wight, and a lot of Isle of Wight fans are out there. So for those of you who are big fans of Dinosaur Isle, it was found on the northwest coast, which is in the Wessex Formation for the most part, meaning it was from the early Cretaceous, very roughly 130 million years ago. For those of you who are not big Dinosaur Isle nerds.
What? No, just kidding.
I mean, we didn't know about it that well until we went to the UK and I guess started the podcast. But Dinosaur Isle is a small island off of the southern coast of Britain that has a ton of dinosaurs for such a small space. It's in between the size of Grenada and Barbados. So if you're familiar with either of those Caribbean islands, it's small. It's a small island. There are no Mesozoic dinosaur fossils on either Grenada or Barbados, for the record. So It's doing way better than most of the islands this size.
Mm-hmm.
Dinosaur Isle had a ton of known dinosaur species before Vectipelta was named. They erode straight out of the cliffs, just like nearby Lyme Regis, where Mary Anning found plesiosaurs. And we talked more about that in our most recent I Know Paleo episode. So if you're a patron, make sure to check out the new plesiosaur episode or consider joining our Patreon. And some of the more recent dinosaur discoveries on Dinosaur Isle are spinosaurs. There were at least 3 spinosaurs on Dinosaur Isle. There was Ceratoseucops, Rapara and Baryonyx. I don't think Baryonyx has been found on the island itself, but it is known from Britain in the same formation, and the island is less than 1 million years old, so it was still firmly attached to the rest of Britain where Baryonyx has been found during the Mesozoic. So we know it was there.
Yeah, Baryonyx, you were there.
Yeah. So there were a lot of big, powerful biting. I think there was a Tyrannosaurid as well, all sorts of other large theropods. So there were a lot of animals that could eat an unsuspecting herbivore.
Oh no, even an armored one?
Well, that's why they needed the armor, presumably. So back to those armored ones, the ankylosaurs. Previously, the only named ankylosaur from Dinosaur Isle is Polacanthus. The holotype is actually from Dinosaur Isle and was found back in 1865.
One of the OGs.
It is, although not as old as Hylaeosaurus, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. It wasn't found too far away. Polacanthus is about 4 to 5 meters or 13 to 16 feet long and somewhere between half a ton and 2 tons in weight. Weight estimates are a lot harder to do, but the skeletal reconstruction of Vectipelta is right in that range. It's a little bit on the higher end based on their silhouette reconstruction. There's roughly 5 meters in their silhouette, which are a little bit under, maybe around 15 feet. They think they have about 2/3 of the vertebral column, which is basically half of the tail, all of the back, and a few neck vertebrae. So I think that length estimate is pretty accurate. I wouldn't expect it to change too much because we have just so much of its length preserved with all those vertebrae. In addition to all those vertebrae, we also have a handful of partial limb bones from both the front and hind limbs. But the most important piece is the relatively complete hips with the armor and ribs intermixed with them. Almost every ankylosaur on Dinosaur Isle has been assigned to Polacanthus since the holotype was found over 150 years ago or over 140 years ago, depending on which origin of the name you want to go by. It is extremely messy. I spent like 2 hours on that. But suffice it to say, it was named sometime between 1865 and 1881. There is one piece of ankylosaur that wasn't assigned to Polacanthus. There's a tibia and humerus, which was assigned to Hylaeosaurus, which is the OG ankylosaur.
Okay.
And one of the 3 original dinosaurs.
I was wondering how you were going to bring Hylaeosaurus into this.
There's even more connections. Hylaeosaurus, we don't talk about Hylaeosaurus enough. It does not get nearly as much love as it deserves.
Nobody talks about Hylaeosaurus enough.
But it's awesome, yeah. So those 2 bones, basically a leg bone and an arm bone, need to be reviewed to make sure they aren't actually Vectipelta, because they basically just got assigned to Hylaeosaurus because
it was the first one.
Yeah. And this was named a really long time ago, or they were described a really long time ago. But unfortunately, there's a decent chance we won't be able to determine which dinosaur the limb bones came from, since they're a little bit fragmentary in Polacanthus and Vectipelta.
Limb bones aren't really how you distinguish ankylosaurs.
No, not usually. It's usually the skull. Both Polacanthus and Vectipelta are mostly known from the hips, vertebrae, and spiky armor, so they're pretty easy to compare to each other. But yeah, since they don't have the skulls of them, it's a little bit harder to compare them with other ankylosaurs. The hips on Vectipelta is covered in a smooth shield with, quote, gently undulating low relief ornamentation, end quote.
All right.
So I guess it's sort of like wavy. One description of it was it sort of has like circular impressions, like lightly in it. And less so than any other ankylosaurs. There's basically like 3 classes of these pelvic shields. And they were like, maybe we need a 4th one because it doesn't quite fit any of them. But that shield protecting the hips is about 1 centimeter or almost half an inch thick. And that's just like the bony shield armor.
It's pretty good.
Right in and like fused solid. In general, it's actually thicker than Polacanthus. Polacanthus is a little bit more variable, but on average, it's a little bit thicker. So it is quite some thorough armor there. The hip shield doesn't have clearly defined osteoderms, but it may have had keratinous scales on it instead, which is pretty cool.
It is.
They did histology on the pelvic shield and said that it had a, quote, complex plywood-like arrangement of structural fiber bundles, end quote, and that, quote, the addition and arrangement of collagenous fibers increases toughness and hinders the spreading of microcracks in bone, end quote.
Good. You don't want cracks in your bone.
You really don't. And in this case, the bone is basically just the armor itself. But obviously, if the armor gets broken, then the stuff underneath it is more vulnerable. So it's nice to have that really intense strength to it. And it's just so cool to think of like a sort of organic plywood shield made out of bone, because we're all familiar with how strong plywood can be. And then on top of that it's got extra fibers through it. I think of like carbon fiber and stuff where it's got like the extra tensile strength and everything embedded in it. It's just so cool. This would have made the area around its hips much more resistant to both bites as well as impacts that might have otherwise punctured or fractured that hip armor. It just sounds like an excellent defense structure, especially since Vectipelta is classified as a nodosaurid and isn't thought to have had a tail club, although we don't know for sure because we didn't find the tip of the tail. We found more of the base of the tail, but most likely it didn't have a tail club, so having that extra armor would definitely be a big advantage. There was a Polacanthus skull that was described in 1982 by W.T. Blows, also from the Isle of Wight, and it's going to be interesting to see if that gets reassigned to Vectipelta, because you never know where it's going to land. In 1993, a brain case was collected by David Cooper, and it's also been described as Polacanthus. Like I said, everything has been, except for that one tibia and humerus that went to Abelisaurid. But the authors of this paper actually think that brain case might belong to the exact Vectipelta holotype. It might be from that exact same individual.
Oh, interesting.
But they weren't able to prove it, and they're not sure if they'll ever be able to determine that for sure.
Oh.
But there might be a way, because there are things you can do with like the chemical analysis of the rock and things like that to nail down just exactly where it came from. The same is true for a couple of limb bones that were also extracted separately. So there might be more of this holotype that gets included later. Not just
cool.
like paratypes, but like that actual individual. Yeah. It's always better when you have as much of a holotype, as complete of an animal as you can possibly have to start out with. The Vectipelta holotype also has some really cool armor in addition to that pelvic shield. It's got about half a dozen really big spikes that presumably stuck out of its side like it does in so many nodosaurids. Some of the spiky armor is considered blade-like and more blade-like than Polacanthus. It's very thin and sharp looking. It's actually really cool. So it almost looks like in the paleo art, I didn't notice this at first because I was like, okay, yeah, it's got the spikes down the side. But if you look closely at the paleo art that came out with it, they're really thin, like sort of compressed from the top and bottom, and then broad in the nose to tail direction. So it almost looks like they're like broad spear points sticking out of its side, and then sort of with the edge going front to back, and then flatter on the top and bottom. It looks really cool. The bone itself is very thin and sharp looking, but on top of that, it would have had a keratin covering, and that might have made it even sharper and pointier. So it could have basically been like it had like knives. or like almost like sharpened claws or something sticking out of its sides.
Just reminded me of like the Game of Thrones throne.
Yeah, or I was thinking about like chariots and stuff where they have like the knives sticking out of the wheels in like, arenas and stuff. It looks pretty epic.
Knives Out too. I think they had a chair. Anyway.
There were swords behind it, or guns or something. Yeah.
Never mind. Not the same.
Or probably knives. Several of these Vectipelta spikes too were very large. A couple of them at least were over 40 centimeters or 16 inches long, and that's just the bone without the keratin. So it certainly would have been formidable. It's got that really good defense on the hips. It's got these big knife-like things going down much of the side. It's not something you probably want to get that close to. A bit like a porcupine with the addition of armor.
Sounds like it needed it with all those predatory dinosaurs on Dinosaur Isle.
That's true. Apparently, Hylaeosaurus also had some of these blade-like spines, which is another way that I think Hylaeosaurus deserves way more credit, because I never hear that talked about. Like that it had these like blade-like things that are so cool on Vectipelta.
At least Hylaeosaurus is in Crystal Palace.
Yeah, facing the other direction and the head broken off somewhere else.
Wow. They replaced the head.
That's true. One of the crazy things about Vectipelta is that phylogenetically, it doesn't look like it was a close relative to Polacanthus or Hylaeosaurus, which were really close geographically. It actually came out in their analysis on the family tree to be closer to a couple of Chinese ankylosaurs.
Okay.
So Zhejiangosaurus and Dongyangopelta both are about 30 million years later in the fossil record. So they're closer to that transition early to late Cretaceous, about 100 million years ago, whereas this is like 130 million years ago.
So some ankylosaurs may have worked their way over from Europe to Asia.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're saying, that they presumably could have made it back and forth all the way to the UK too, not just Europe, and then to China, which is about as far east in Asia as you can get. It's a very long distance to trek, which is not too bad considering we're basically talking about giant tortoises. It's a long way to go.
Slow and steady, they made it.
Yeah. I mean, 30 million years is a long time. You can
Yeah.
cover a lot of distance in 30 million years. They also estimate that Vectipelta, Polacanthus, and Hylaeosaurus lived at different times. They think the oldest was Hylaeosaurus, which is fitting since it's the first ankylosaur humans ever found. It's estimated to be about 136 million years old. Vectipelta is about 3 million years more recent. So maybe in this case, that would be about 133, maybe 130. And then Polacanthus, at least the holotype, is another 6 to 8 million years younger. And I say the holotype because there are a lot of Polacanthus individuals and they actually span many millions of years, which is another reason some of them might be Vectipelta.
That's interesting that Vectipelta's in the middle there in terms of when they lived, but Hylaeosaurus and Polacanthus are the ones that are more closely related.
Yeah. Evolution is very messy. And it's just like today, you know, like if you look at mammals in one specific region, they're not all super close relatives, right? Like a squirrel in the US is more closely related to a squirrel in Europe than it is to like a dog in the US or something. You know, there's complex webs and animals moving all over the place.
I feel like that's a little bit different because we're talking about 3 different ankylosaurs.
Yeah, they're all placental mammals.
Yeah.
We're pretty closely related. From an ankylosaur's perspective, they're probably completely different. They would be offended if they heard you said this.
Maybe.
Well, I guess they wouldn't because they don't speak English. But if they could. And even that span of time, 6 to 8 million years between Polacanthus and Vectipelta, doesn't sound like that much in the scheme of dinosaurs. But I like to think of 8 million years as about how long you have to go back in time from today to reach the common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans. When you think of it that way, that's a lot of evolution that can happen in 8 million years.
Yes.
If you want to see Vectipelta, it's on display at the Dinosaur Isle Museum in the Isle of Wight. I believe it's still on display. I saw a picture of it there. And from the picture, it looks like its bones are laid out underneath a standing theropod mount. But there's probably space limitations in this museum. But I just thought it was kind of funny that they had like a theropod mount and they're like, we could squeeze this in on the floor below it.
At least the theropod's not eating it like Hatcher.
True. Yeah.
All right. As promised, there's also a new ornithopod dinosaur to talk about. But I'll start off with a question. How many bones, Garrett, do you think you need to name a new dinosaur?
Well, a lot of people do it with just one.
Yep. And that's the case here.
That's another need. Like you were saying, I need to start with the ankylosaur first.
Yeah.
How many do you need? Depends on what the bone is and how good it is. Hopefully it's not just a tooth.
It's not a tooth. So this dinosaur, first I'll say, it was named by Albert Prieto Marquez and Albert Sayez. And this was published in JVP. And they named a new ornithopod based on a left foot bone, specifically metatarsal 4.
That's not the greatest.
It's better than a tooth.
Yeah, I guess.
They said it was unlike other ornithopod foot bones. It's unique with long proportions and other details. The name of the dinosaur is Calvarius rapidus. It's a Styracosternan dinosaur, which is a subgroup that includes Fukuisaurus, Hippodraco, Iguanocolossus, and others, all iguanodonts. And it lived in the Late Cretaceous in what is now Spain in the Huincul Formation. Now, based on its foot, this dinosaur was probably lightly built and pretty small and a runner. Now, why is this important? Well, it helps show possible convergent evolution with non-iguanodonts and early diverging iguanodontian ornithopods.
Because those were also faster, presumably?
Yes, the proportions of its foot bone are similar to more basal ornithischians like Hypsilophodon and then early diverging iguanodonts like Disaltosaurus, but not like other Styracosternan iguanodonts like Iguanodon or Gripposaurus, which are more stout. So other Styracosternans were not as speedy as this one.
I guess that kind of begs the question, how do we know it isn't just one of those earlier dinosaurs? But I guess based on the formation it's in would be the answer.
The time and the place. So this dinosaur, Calvarius, filled a niche in its habitat, which was on an island. It also lived alongside the troodontid tamaro. By the late Cretaceous, small-bodied runners were tended to be non-iguanodontians and non-hadrosauriforms, but on this island, it was Calvarius, a Styracosternan, that filled this niche, being small and running.
Sort of like how on some islands you've got sauropods filling the niche of like a medium to small-sized herbivore, where normally there would be like a hadrosaur.
Yes. So the full name of the dinosaur is, again, Calvarius rapidus, and the genus name refers to a nearby hill known as Serrat del Calvari, and it also means suffering, and that refers to the fact that this dinosaur lived right around the KPG extinction.
Oh.
Yeah. Poor dino.
This one probably didn't have anything to do with that extinction event.
Yeah.
So it probably didn't suffer from the effects of the asteroid impact.
Might have suffered in other ways.
I mean, eventually it fossilized, but...
Yeah. Oh, I was thinking how dinosaurs tended to live rough lives.
Oh, yeah, that is true.
Yep.
Hopefully this one didn't. We probably don't have any paleopathologies in that one foot bone.
No, hopefully they find more fossils. Maybe there'll be some paleopathologies. Who knows? The species name rapidus means rapid. That refers to it probably being a runner. The fossil was found in 2019 by a team of paleontologists. For this study, they did histology on the foot bone and found that it was a late subadult. It was very close to being mature. There were 7 lags, but also some intense bone remodeling, so they figured out that there was 1 missing lag, so it had up to 8 lags when it died.
Meaning it was up to 8 years old, basically?
Yes. And Styracosternans such as Maiasaura and Probrachylophosaurus reached skeletal maturity around 8 to 10 years old, so based on that, Calvarius was probably close to being mature. And being on an island and also based on the foot bone, they're thinking it was probably small.
Well, they didn't give like a height and length and weight estimate based on that one tiny bone?
No, we need more fossils for that.
Sometimes people go for it, because if it's similar enough, you can say like, oh, in this other dinosaur, its foot was about this big, so we'll just estimate it. But given this one at different proportions, that's probably hard to do.
I'd say Albert Prieto Marquez is probably known for naming a lot of dinosaurs.
He does lean on the I'll name it with one bone side of things more than most.
He's willing, well, just like all scientists, though, like if he's proven wrong, then he goes back and says, okay, we will lump or we will split, whatever makes sense.
Yeah, he would. When we interviewed him, he was basically saying like, well, you got to call it something.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to just have catalog numbers all the time, so I'll name it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's a lot easier to talk about Calvarius than specimen number.
We don't even know what the specimen number is.
I'd have to look it up. But I didn't bother writing it down because I know the name of this dinosaur.
And if it's unique enough, you know, I guess that's the thing. How unique is unique enough?
Mm-hmm. One last thing before we get into our interview, I just want to say thank you to our listener, Andreas, for sending us a short film called We Hunt Giants, recently co-produced by Andreas and friend Titus. And it was really fun to watch. It's under 7 minutes long. We'll have a link in our show notes if you want to watch too. This film takes place in an alternate universe where dinosaurs and humans live alongside each other, and humans are the bottom of the food chain.
Oh, no.
Yeah. There's a group of hunters that are trying to take down a T-Rex that has been hunting them. I like that it's set in the snow and it shows some dinos in the snow. It was filmed in Sweden. You can see a few different dinosaurs in it, but the main one is the T-Rex, and the hunters try to lure it out with some raw meat, which I think is a chunk of a leg. Just as a side note, we've been watching a lot of the show Alone lately, and the snow and seeing that meat lure or trap really reminded me of Alone.
So when you first described this, I assumed it was animated, but now it sounds like it's more live action.
Yes, live action with CGI dinosaurs.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah, and the T-Rex looks pretty cool. There's some good details, like it's a clapper, not a slapper.
Meaning its arms aren't pronated incorrectly.
Yeah, they're facing each other. The hands are facing each other. So it sounds like an interesting story. I hope they're able to turn it into a full-length film someday. It took them about 1.5 years to make this short. And if you're like me and you enjoy seeing a breakdown of the special effects, they also have a short technical breakdown video, and you can see all the steps involved in making the CGI dinosaurs.
Nice. And in just a moment, we'll get on to our interview with Will Tattersdill. But first, we're going to pause for a quick sponsor break. And now on to our interview with Will Tattersdill. But as always, we got really talking. So we had to edit it down to fit it in this episode. But if you'd like the extended version and you're a patron, you can get that in your premium content feed. And if you're not a patron, consider becoming a patron, and then you can listen to it.
Yes.
We're joined this week by Dr. Will Tattersdill, a senior lecturer in literature and contemporary fantasy cultures at the University of Glasgow. He's an expert in late Victorian science fiction and explores how the connections between dinosaur science and science fiction happen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, how did you get interested in the connection between dinosaur science and how they're portrayed in popular media?
The same way everyone does, I suppose, which is that I was doing a doctorate about late 19th century science fiction. And one of the things I was writing about, one of the things I try to do as a literary critic is always to question this idea that is still very powerful in culture, I think in America as well, that science and art are kind of at odds, and that you either are good at one or the other, you're interested in one or the other. And that never worked for me. So a lot of what I write is about trying to question that. And at some point it occurred to me that the dinosaurs are a really, really amazing kind of case study, if you like, for that argument, because the dinosaur as we have it today can't exist without both a very powerful scientific establishment and also a very highly developed cultural imagination kind of working together. They are not objects that could exist without science and art. So for me, they're a really good way of kind of breaking down that barrier between what still sometimes gets called the two cultures, at least in my neck of the woods. I don't know, do Americans say that?
I haven't heard that one.
I haven't heard, yeah.
No, okay, all right. It's probably for the best. It's a phrase I would dearly like to expunge, actually. But this is an idea from a Reed lecture in the 1950s of the two cultures, literary intellectuals on one hand who only care about, the classics and don't know the second law of thermodynamics even. And then on the other hand, all these scientific upstarts who think they can solve the world's problems. And both camps completely incapable of talking to each other, equally annoying, equally arrogant, equally awful. This is kind of the old cliche, but cliches are kind of a powerful thing. And I think there's still plenty of people around who kind of believe in that, even if they don't phrase it that way to themselves quite. So yeah, that was it really. And then I started, and then what happened was I was like, well, someone must have written a book where they go into the kind of the cultural side of what a dinosaur is. And I went looking for one and couldn't find it. So then I was like, okay, I guess I got to write it. And now it's been 10 years and several quite good books about it have come out, but I'm still working on mine. So that's my story.
Nice. So was there something specific, because I know you're an expert in Victorian literature, was there something in the Victorian literature that first you encountered and you were like, oh, dinosaurs? Like, was there a first introduction to it?
Yeah, well, this is going to sound prejudicial, but dinosaurs are a Victorian thing. They're designated in 1842 by Richard Owen, as I'm sure you know. And that word in 1842, Dinosauria, is a very technical term. It's kind of specialists only. By the early 20th century, just by the time Victoria dies, people in popular culture are starting to understand what it means. So really the Victorian age is the age where the dinosaur turns it from the kind of this niche pursuit from the age of reptiles, to the symbol of prehistoric life, I suppose. So in that sense, the Victorian period is a place to start because it's where these things start. The magazines I was reading, to answer your question more properly, have a kind of a subcurrent of fossil fiction where people are finding, it's often kind of cryptozoological stuff. And I guess they're the forerunners of today's creature features where people go spelunking and find some kind of hideous living fossil that tries to eat them or whatever. So I was already kind of thinking about them from that angle. But then you hit the 20th century and almost straight away things start happening because Carnegie finds his Diplodocus and starts mailing copies of it around the world, and one thing leads to another. But something that struck me early in the project, and I guess one of the main reasons that I was intrigued by the question, was the way that dinosaur skeletons feel like they belong in big old Victorian buildings, 19th century buildings. And of course, there are lovely glass buildings with dinosaurs in LA, for example, but it's not quite the same. You want those big stone pillars and that neo-Gothic architecture. And there's something that for some reason the dinosaur skeleton works in there. And I was like, well, why is that? That's insane that these ancient animals are in kind of aesthetic accordance with a particular era of architectural history. That's really weird. We all just accept that, don't we? So I was thinking, why? Why is that? And I guess, that's what got me started on it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think there is something to that, especially with like the way bones are mounted. A lot of times there's sort of this metal armature all around it. It's similar to those old buildings where you can see a lot of the metal holding up the building, and it's sort of a design feature of it, and it's also functional. And I really like that comparison.
Totally. I mean, I don't know if you know it, but the Oxford University Natural History Museum, which is a pre-Raphaelite building, it's the same age as the dinosaurs. It's got these big kind of metal pillars holding up this beautiful kind of glass ceiling, but kind of quite small panes of glass because it was the 1860s. And it really does look skeletal. And then, there's a Tyrannosaurus under it and an iguanodon as well. So, it's all skeletal architecture. And then, of course, it's Gothic architecture. And the Gothic is, in literary terms, is the language of the thing in the cellar and the resurrected secret and the monster in the closets and all of those other things. So there's a real sympathy there for sure.
That's a good point. Yeah, I never made that connection between like the sort of catacombs vibe along with these skeletons of giant dinosaurs.
Totally. Yeah, it's absolutely the catacombs, isn't it? That's so true. And you go, with all the macabreness and right, this is the bones of something. We don't really necessarily figure them precisely like that anymore. But something about the London Natural History Museum, when it first opened in the 1880s, it was really dark. The reviewers didn't like it because they hadn't left enough windows and there wasn't good enough lighting to do it properly like they have now on the inside. And so people are saying, my kids are getting scared. It's a spooky place. Yeah. So, the halls of the dead. Absolutely right.
I'm just imagining that. Because that would have been, they wouldn't have had great lighting options back then either. So at best, it would be like, gas lamps or candlelight. Yep. You're going into a room full of bones in the dark.
Absolutely. And with tiny windows high up, so you're getting these shafts of light. It's going to be a very different experience from going there now. And there's TVs everywhere and everything,
Yeah.
Othniel Marsh, as I'm sure you know, was very opposed to putting up skeletons like that because his position was, we don't know enough.
Was he in the camp of, I know there was an Archaeopteryx drawn and they drew it without a head because they didn't know what the head looked like. That's the kind of thing he would...
That's Figuier, I think. Yeah. Well, he simply wouldn't have let anyone draw the Archaeopteryx. I think my sense of him, I'm happy to be corrected by any Marsh maniacs I'm offending here. But my sense of him was he thought that to reconstruct even skeletally just a flat picture of the kind that is now completely uncontroversial, for him that was too much. He did do it occasionally. He's done it. He did it with his Brontosaurus, for instance. Mm-hmm. But I think he felt, we've got to be really careful with this because I guess because among other things, probably maniacs might get hold of it, and it at that time is a pretty crazy thing. At the time he's saying this, no one has mounted a full sauropod skeleton yet. That's coming. And I think he thinks people will freak out. But mainly what he thinks is we don't know it's right. We can't prove it, right? It's not science. So he's being kind of fusty about it, or overcautious, or however you want to say it.
I find that so interesting that he was willing to name so many dinosaurs based on just a bone here, bone there. But no, don't reconstruct it.
Yeah. Well, he was in his famous race with Cope, wasn't he? And had his reputation to think of. Yeah, who knows what he was thinking? I think it was his way of counterbalancing what he saw as Cope's kind of pandering to sensational kind of. Cope was a rock star, wasn't he? He's a young Turk and he's got the whole world in his hand, and I'm doing science properly, actually. That's the image he's projecting, as far as I understand it.
Cope, the Quaker rock star. It's a funny combination. So we spoke with John Holmes about the Tolkien presentation you helped put together. Is there anything you found interesting about Tolkien's descriptions of dinosaurs or how dinosaurs are related to his work?
So Tolkien, you're going to talk about prehistory and Lord of the Rings, and people start looking at you funny, especially if they've tried to read the Silmarillion.
Yeah, I tried.
Lots of people have tried. And listen, there's no shame in not. I'm not one of those people who thinks you should have read the Silmarillion. It's not a friendly read. But Arda has some geological history, that's clear. And although it feels a bit weird to talk about the geology of Tolkien, the prehistory of Tolkien, regardless of the specifics, I think it's clear that he understood that depth was important when you were creating a world for yourself. So in what Tolkien calls secondary world building or sub-creation, that was his word for it, which is where he starts with the languages. A lot of other people start with the map, but you're just making something up from scratch. And one of his big insights there is you have to put history onto that world, or it doesn't work. It doesn't feel right. So in the shallower fantasy worlds, especially of the sort of 80s, 90s swords and sorcery type, you just get the feeling that this is a place that has always been like this and always will be like this. And Tolkien never lets that happen, right? There's all these eras and there's always change. There's always history. There's always history on a human scale, right? Mm-hmm. History in the hundreds or thousands of years. But I think he does understand that there needs to be something deeper in the rock as well. There are times when he's describing, especially the dwarves mining, Gandalf falling in Dwaradelf and all the rest of it, down through kind of layers and layers of recorded history and things like that. So, we know that he gave a lecture, and this is what you referred to, at the Natural History Museum in Oxford, where he sort of, at the very least, collaborated with the museum and looking at some of their fossil specimens. And that lecture is very much about the relationship between dragons and dinosaurs, which is something that people are very keen on still, obviously, this idea that dragon myths kind of presage the dinosaur discoveries in some way or other. So Tolkien's lecture kind of talks about those, talks about the kind of the medieval precedents for dragons in the sagas, for Fafnir and other big, scary medieval dragons like that. And he's kind of, I think he's kind of saying that there is an artistic history here and there is a scientific history here. He's sort of, again, aware that you need both for these things to work. So yeah, I mean, you wouldn't describe him necessarily as a scientific author, right? But it's still that awareness of the importance of there being time in the landscape, I think, is really key.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I also, I remember I heard once that the difference between fantasy and sci-fi is that sci-fi has rivets and fantasy has like fairies. But other than that, they're like exactly the same.
Well, this is the thing, right? And so, this has been an interesting thing. So my job, as you mentioned at the beginning, is that I work in the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic at Glasgow University, which is a centre devoted entirely to studying and teaching fantasy literature. It's very unusual. Most universities do not have one of these, right? And initially, because my PhD used the word science fiction a lot more than the word fantasy, I was kind of nervous about that transition, I suppose, in some way. But I've been writing about fantasy all along because, like you say, that line is so slippery. So the idea that the dinosaur-dragon difference is a genre difference. That as soon as it's a dinosaur, you're dealing with sci-fi, and as soon as it's a dragon, you're dealing with fantasy. And it's really convenient, and it would be lovely if it worked, but it doesn't work, right? Whether it's Victor Milan's Dragon Knights, which is a sort of sub Game of Thrones kind of fantasy epic where everyone's riding dinosaurs instead of horses. Or whether it's Anne McCaffrey and the Dragon Riders of Pern, which is science fictional in many ways. It's set in the far future on another planet, all the rest of it. It doesn't work at all. And then you think about the big ones, right? Think about Jurassic Park, which gets all kinds of genre labels put on it, whether it's horror for a start, but sci-fi often because there's the genetic engineering side of it. Or is it the creature feature, or is it action, blockbuster, where does it belong? But fantasy is completely fine to me as a way of describing what that movie is doing effectively, because what that movie's about really, for me, is it's about that scene where Richard Attenborough Hammond is talking about the flea circus and wanting something to be real. That's the heart of the film. And that's Spielberg as well, right? Making movies, wanting it to be real. That is a fantasy film for me. Now, other people define these things differently, and that's the conversation, and that's how it goes, and that's fine. But I don't like that idea of the dinosaur as kind of innate to sci-fi, because that takes all of that fantasy and all of that longing out of what the dinosaur is. And I think you need that fantasy in order to understand the dinosaur, even if you're just reading technical publications, because there's no point restoring these animals if you don't at some level wish to imagine them restored.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think for most dinosaur fans, Jurassic Park could be best defined as a fantasy story, because people come out of that movie and they're like, yeah, I wish that was true. Like, they ignore all the horrible things that go wrong. It's like, I want that.
And the whole force of Crichton's novel is like, this is a bad idea. And then everyone watches it and is like, when can we do it? Can I go? Is it possible? I've heard so many people say to me over the years, I'd love a version where nothing went wrong, where they didn't get out, and it was just like people having a nice time eating the dinosaurs.
The more fantasy side of it than the horror side of it.
Totally, 100%. But this is, for me, what's important about dinosaurs is the way they can do both, right? It's a both and situation. So they're horrible and terrifying, and they're monsters, and they're going to eat you. And they're these beautiful, lost things that we want to have this moment of contact with. And Jurassic Park's genius is that it gives you both of those things in such a crystallized kind of Spielbergy sort of way. Yeah. You feel that terror and you feel that wonder, and you want to be there and you don't want to be there. And that's done everywhere you look at dinosaurs. That's what they do, right? Their art and their science. They're dead and they're alive. They're niche and they're everywhere. They're for kids and they're too grown up for kids. They're everything. Whenever there's a binary, there's always a dinosaur crossing it. That's why I like them.
Yeah. They are great.
Before we started recording, you said that you had gone to Alberta and got to work a little bit with dinosaurs. I'd love to hear about it, but also, what were you doing, research?
Yeah, well, so in my field, which is English literature, the way research works is you go to the library for a few years and then you write a book, and then they put that book in the same library that you were in for those years, and then you die. So the nice thing about this subject is that occasionally I've got to do something slightly differently. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to write a book that basically says what I just said to you about dinosaurs doing both. And an opportunity came up to go and hang out in University of Alberta and to just get a feel of what that department is like. Obviously, it's a very significant department in terms of the history of dinosaur research, but also I was at that time very familiar with the kind of pop cultural side of the dinosaur, and I wanted to learn more about what kind of the daily life of the people who dug them up and described them was like. So I was taking opportunities to hang out with people in the geology department at my university I was at the time, which was Birmingham University. But basically, whenever there's a chance to talk to a geologist, I take it. So I was in Alberta, and yeah, it was a really amazing week for me. I got to sit down and talk to a huge range of people, including Phil Curry, who was really generous with his time. Really lovely guy. I have hours of recorded conversations from all sorts of people in that department. And then there was this pandemic thing, and I have still just got those recordings, and I feel quite guilty because I owe them a publication, I think, for them having looked after me so nicely. But what was, and they'll get it. If you're listening, Phil, I'm on it, just very, very slowly. I think what was interesting about it for me is just kind of seeing the difference between kind of what a dinosaur is to me as someone who encounters them primarily as kind of literary devices or objects, to go into a place where they are like quite literally doorstops, just a big old vertebra holding the door open that nobody needs. They were, at the time I was there, they were working on it was winter, so they were inside, and they were working on a Styracosaurus skull, which was, without question, one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen up close. It was just completely amazing. It was just really nice to watch them just kind of working on bringing it back, very... so a real privilege to see inside it. But from a scholarly perspective, the opportunity was to think about how different these questions look and how similar they look when you're, as it were, at the coalface.
I guess having talked about dinosaurs a lot in the last 8 years, I kind of forgot about the the other side of it from before I started reading all these scientific papers.
Yeah. What people that have just seen Jurassic Park once and they have that sort of vision of a dinosaur and then don't think about it all that often.
Yeah, completely. Well, and because for all the reasons we just mentioned, Jurassic Park remains so influential, right? So most people are probably still imagining stuff that looks more or less like that. And, and that represents a significant improvement on what they were imagining in the 1980s, but it's not how we're supposed to be imagining it. It's wrong. It's wrong, right? So, a question that really interests me is what is wrong, right? Like, what's the right way? What's the ethical way to imagine a dinosaur right now? Do you have to go and read everything and understand everything and do all the necessary degrees? This is another both and thing, right? With dinosaurs, everyone knows what they look like and no one knows what they look like. They're completely mysterious and they're absolutely everywhere.
Yeah, we usually say like the wrong is sort of temporal. So like Crystal Palace dinosaurs aren't wrong. That's just the Victorian version.
Yeah.
And I don't even consider Jurassic Park dinosaurs to be particularly wrong because
in the 90s, that's
in
what
most
we knew.
cases, Dilophosaurus, there's a couple exceptions where they went kind of weird
Liberties.
with it. Yeah. But in general, it was like the best depiction of dinosaurs to that time was Jurassic Park.
For sure.
And now you've got Prehistoric Planet is probably the best depiction of dinosaurs that's been done so far. And yeah, it's sort of like the time shot of like, that's the most accurate version we have. But you're right. It's all wrong. Like, they're all just approximations when you're talking about paleontology. So there's always going to be room for interpretation. We're never going to know exactly what these things looked like.
Totally. And yeah, that's how I start. Sometimes when I give talks about this, I say no human's ever seen a non-avian dinosaur and no human ever will. And there is, to me, still a violence in that statement, actually, because of what we were saying before about how important fantasy is and how how desperately on both the science and art side, we may want that not to be true. But there is this weird thing about them, again, with their both andness, right? Because, it makes them completely alien, completely other. There is an unreachability about the dinosaur. At the same time, they're entirely ours, right? Because they're not around to object to us, right? You characterize a dog in a certain way. Well, there's hundreds of dogs you're going to see every day. You're going to be proved wrong, right? So I think, they have that mixture of kind of, they're entirely kind of subject to how we want to imagine them, at the same time, completely out of reach. Because whatever was crunching around back in the Mesozoic that's not something we can get at, not ever quite get at it. And Darwin knew about it. There's this bit in The Origin where Darwin's like, he's thinking about the geological record, not about dinosaurs in particular. He doesn't care about them, but he's, we're never going to get it all. The book of nature is not complete. The pages are missing, which is just heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
Science or art is heartbreaking, but it's also, humans are narrative animals, right? And it's also an opportunity. As soon as there's a missing page, someone is going to write something to put in that spot. That's how we work. And that, I suppose, is where I come in.
So when can we expect your book?
Oh, my goodness me. I mean, that's a rude question. Yeah, I'm working on it. It's becoming, I need to get on with it. I'm starting to lose my authority to tell my students to hit their deadlines because I've been writing this book for a long time now, and it's starting to get a bit. The first bit I wrote needs updating. It's that old. But also in my defense, it's how you just mentioned Prehistoric Planet, which is a complete game changer as far as everything I'm writing is concerned. So I need to go back and rethink everything. But we're naming roughly one new dinosaur a week at the moment, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It is really hard to, it's not that I was ever properly kept up, but it's really hard to keep up.
Mm-hmm.
It is, yeah.
And on the humanities side too, in a much quieter way, but I said at the start, there are a few more books about this sort of thing now than there were when I began. So those are all my excuses, Sabrina, and I'm really sorry. I hope it will be in the next few years, but it's not going to be very soon, because I'm also tasked with editing H.G. Wells's short stories, which is a non-dino for the most part project that I'm excited about, and I do teaching-y things as well. So watch this space, but perhaps not too closely. It'll be a long one of these days.
Well, we'll keep an eye out.
So is there a place online where people can get updated when these things are released? How about the H.G. Wells short stories?
Those are coming out in Oxford World's Classics series, which is printed by the Oxford University Press. And I think we are aiming for late next year, so 24, that would be with those. We haven't an exact date yet. So H.G. Wells doesn't do a lot with dinosaurs directly, but there are some nice dino-adjacent things that he does. For example, In the Abyss, which is a story about a guy who goes on a bathysphere dive, basically, and finds a civilization of reptiloid mer people living at the bottom of the sea who are very surprised to see him. Things like that. So Wells is just an endlessly joyful writer, and I'm sure that if you're listening to this, that at least some of his big stories, A Time Machine, The War of the Worlds, even if you haven't read them, they're very powerful still. His short stories, of which he wrote around 90,
Wow.
depending on how you count them, are underused, and some of them are really, really, really exciting. And a lot of them kind of are at that interface, again, not with the dinosaur thing, but with what is a scientist as a private individual when they're out in the world. He has a lot of stories where people encounter baffling things that are outside their own experience and try to make sense of them. And the thing might be scientifically explicable. It might be a Martian, right? It might be a door to fairyland. It might just be a social situation they don't move in. He doesn't care about the sci-fi fantasy genre spectrum label either. What he cares about is people who are suddenly pushed out of their comfort zone, out of their world, either metaphorically or literally. And so yeah, I think he's still a hugely helpful person to read about all of those things. So this is not dino-y enough, so I'll stop talking about it. But yeah, what I'm doing is I'm trying to get an edition of those stories together with notes about kind of the newspapers and magazines where they first appeared for people to kind of get a sense of what that culture was like at the end of the last century.
Awesome.
Cool.
Do you have a Twitter or social media or something that people can follow if they want to stay up to date on these projects?
So the Twitter is just at Will Tattersdill, all one word. I'm using it less and less, to be honest. There's a big paleo community now moving on to Mastodon very appropriately. And I'll probably be on there at some point. But yeah, for now I'm on Twitter.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was a delightful conversation,
Yes.
and we appreciate your time.
Oh, I appreciate yours. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much, Will. It was a lot of fun talking about science fiction and dinosaurs, and I love seeing the intersection there.
Yeah, and sort of the origins of all the sci-fi that we all take for granted. Like, of course, there's dinosaur movies and dinosaur books and everything, but at one point that was all new, which is so cool.
Mm-hmm. We'll get into our dinosaur of the day, Ilokelesia, but before that, we're going to take a quick break for our sponsors. And now onto our dinosaur of the day, Ilokelesia, which was a request from Tyrant King via our Patreon and Discord, so thanks. It was an Abelisaurid theropod that lived in the Late Cretaceous in what is now Neuquén Province, Argentina, in the Huincul Formation. It kind of looked like Carnotaurus, but without the horns. It walked on two legs, and it had a long tail and long legs and very short arms. It's considered to be medium-sized. There are several size estimates. There's some at 13 feet or 4 meters long and weighing 440 pounds or 200 kilograms, or 17 feet, 5.3 meters long, or 19 feet, 5.8 meters long and weighing 1,850 pounds or 840 kilograms.
It's a pretty big size range.
Yes.
Although not quite as big as Polacanthus, which is like half a ton to 2 tons. This is like half a ton to, actually a quarter of a ton to 1 ton. So I guess it is still like a factor of 4.
Ilokelesia was described in 1998 by Rodolfo Coria and Leonardo Salgado. Fragments of the skull and skeleton were found in 1991. The holotype included part of the skull, 5 articulated tail vertebrae, a couple neck and back bones vertebrae, cervical ribs, and parts of, it was either the hands or the feet. I couldn't tell exactly based on the description because it's just a few bones. Maybe it's both.
Well, it's good that they found part of the skull. That way they could tell that missing horns feature.
True.
How it differs from Carnotaurus, which is, honestly, just makes it less cool than Carnotaurus.
Oh.
Carnotaurus without horns is like, what's the point?
Ouch. I disagree. There are some unique features in the skull bones and in the vertebrae, like in the hollow depressions in the bones. The type species is Ilokelesia aguadagrandensis, and the genus name means flesh lizard or a flesh-eating reptile. Pretty good name.
That is a good name.
Mm-hmm. And the species name refers to where the fossils were found in Aguada Grande. It lived in an arid environment, and other dinosaurs that lived around the same time and place include Carcharodontosaurs, such as Mapusaurus and Meraxes, titanosaurs, including Argentinosaurus and Chukarosaurus, and hadrosaurs.
So it was quite a while before Carnotaurus then.
There we go. Took some time to develop those horns.
If it's a direct ancestor, which I guess is a big question mark.
Oh, yeah. Good point.
And our fun fact of the day builds on Ilokelesia, and it's that Carnotaurus had the proportionally shortest hands of any large carnivorous dinosaur.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, its hands are crazy. So this is according to Javier Ruiz and others in a 2011 paper. They said Carnotaurus had the shortest arms proportionally of any large theropod. But since that's from 2011, and there have been many hundreds of dinosaurs discovered since 2011, I wasn't comfortable saying shortest arms still because there were some other Carcharodontosaurids and things.
That's why you went with hands.
I went with hands because its hands are especially crazy. Unfortunately, we don't have any finger bones from Ilokelesia for comparison, so I can't say definitively that its hands were longer. In fact, we don't have the hand bones from a lot of dinosaurs.
Oh, so maybe Carnotaurus is winning by default.
Yeah. So I have to base it just on the shortest hands of any dinosaur hands that we have found. Yeah, hands are pretty rare. They're certainly not the most common bones by a long shot. For Carnotaurus, things start out good at the shoulder in terms of, sizable, powerful limbs go. They had really big, impressive shoulder blades. They also had a nice big ball and socket type attachment between the upper arm and the shoulder. But things really shrink down and get weird as you move towards the fingers.
All right.
So once you get past that socket joint in the upper arm, the upper arms are still pretty sturdy looking, although definitely on the short side, but it's pretty robust, as we like to say. It's a sturdy arm that looks like it was probably pretty powerful. Could have had some good muscle attachments, maybe even managed a partial push-up. I don't know if that's the case because it was pretty heavy, but could have pushed on something. The forearm is really short. It's only about a quarter the length of the upper arm.
Ooh.
So like with our arms, like you can touch your own shoulder with the same arm. That's because the forearm and the upper arm are about the same length. But Carnotaurus definitely couldn't do that. I guess if it folded its arm, it would be lucky if it could like tickle its bicep or something.
Would you ever want to tickle your bicep?
I don't know. But it gets even weirder because it has no wrist bones at all. The hand bones attach directly to the forearm. So
that is different.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to know unless you look at a skeleton how important and how many wrist bones we have.
Mm-hmm.
But they make that hinge between your hand and your arm. But they're sort of buried in there, pretty small, but very important to add the flexibility for the hand bones. On top of that, the fingers are also missing in some cases. So they basically, some of the fingers where a finger would be is just like a single hand bone, which is very weird. The entire hand is only about 12 centimeters or 4.5 inches long. And again, Carnotaurus is about 25 feet long. So that is a very small fraction of the length of the animal for its hand.
Yes.
In fact, a Carnotaurus hand is only about 2/3 the length of an average adult human hand.
Oh, that's weird because it's so much bigger than a human.
Yes, and its hands are smaller than our hands, which is just so funny because it's like if you high-fived a Carnotaurus, be like high-fiving a child. Except a child with huge, sharp teeth that could easily eat you.
Yeah, don't high-five a Carnotaurus.
Yeah. A claw alone on a T-Rex was probably about as long as the entire hand of a Carnotaurus.
Take that, Carnotaurus.
Yeah, and also everybody thinks a T-Rex is the one with tiny, wimpy hands and arms. But it's not even a close comparison. T-Rex have way more impressive arms and hands than Carnotaurus. T-Rex, for the record, had a hand that was roughly in the 20 to 30 centimeter or 8 to 12 inch long range. And obviously a good portion of that is that large, sharp claw. They did only have the 2 fingers. But Carnotaurus also basically only had 2 fingers. It kind of had 4 fingers, or at least that's how it looks in a skeletal mount. But it turns out that the 2 outer hand bones are just hand bones. They don't actually have fingers sticking out of them. So
and we know they're not missing.
Yeah, especially for the one that is the pinky. The pinky is maybe the weirdest part of the entire arm, or I shouldn't even call it a pinky because it's a hand bone. So like in our case, it would be like the bone in the hand that goes between the wrist and the knuckle leading up to the pinky. So that pinky hand bone seems pretty definitive that there is no bone after it. That there's definitely no pinky attached to it. And that's because it basically tapers to a point.
Oh, interesting.
There isn't really anywhere for a finger bone to attach to it. It's also true on the other side. So like the equivalent of our pointer finger, I guess, if it didn't have a thumb, because it just has the 4 fingers. So it's only the 2 middle fingers that basically have any finger bones. The middle hand bones that have finger bones. They're also not all that useful because if you imagine basically that pinky bone is sort of like if you have your thumb, just one of your thumb bones connected directly to your arm with no wrist, no hand bones. Like, it's not a very useful structure.
It's like a stick.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe you could poke some stuff. It's also been proposed that all the fingers were likely fused into rigid structures, and they might not have even had claws, which is very strange. But that fourth finger is even stranger than I made it sound before, because it's also super long. I keep calling it a finger, but really it's just a hand bone. It's about 3 to 4 times as long as the other metacarpals, or the hand bones that lead to the fingers, which just makes it this extremely long, sort of pointy, long, dead-end hand bone without a wrist. It's just so strange. It's hard to even describe how strange this hand is.
Was evolution slowly going towards the way of no hands?
It seems that way, but at the same time, its upper arm is more robust, and it's got like that good like ball and socket joint. So it's like the upper arm seems like it was important, and the hand seems like it's completely pointless, which is just like, how can you really want half of an arm? Like the top half of the arm is really important, and the end of it is pointless. It's so weird. So Aucasaurus and Majungasaurus, for example, both had longer arms than Carnotaurus, but they weren't as thick. So they weren't as strong, probably, as Carnotaurus, at least the upper arm part. So Carnotaurus was probably doing something really weird with its arms. I like in Prehistoric Planet how they had that display hypothesis.
Yeah.
I've seen it too, where they sort of like spin the arms around.
Yeah.
I don't think they did that in Prehistoric Planet. I think it was more just like a stretch. But I think I like the spinning idea because it's like, yeah, maybe it needed those muscles so it could really whip those arms around in a really impressive display kind of way. And then the hand was like, it doesn't need the hand. Or maybe there's like feathers on it or something. So that's a Carnotaurus arm and a Carnotaurus hand. One of the strangest structures in all of dinosaurs, I think.
And apparently a very short hand, or the shortest hand.
And if you want to be fun at a party and someone's doing like T-Rex arm jokes, be like, oh, T-Rex, it's got pretty good arms compared to Carnotaurus.
If you want to be pedantic at a party.
If people have seen Prehistoric Planet, they might appreciate it.
That's true.
Otherwise, they might not.
And that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you so much for listening. Stay tuned. Next week, we'll be covering a couple new dinosaurs. And if you liked this episode, and if you like our episodes in general, please tell a friend. Thanks for listening, and until next time.